Hi, my name is Meng. I'm from Design Plus Code. And today, this is part of a live stream. We're actually having a meeting with my team right now. And we're trying something, which is that at the same time that I'm doing my weekly presentation, I'm also going to be adding that as part of the live stream. So today, I want to show you how to design and code. Isn't that amazing? That's the name of our place. I want to show you guys SwiftUI because I love SwiftUI. And we're going to be designing a very simple user interface, and that is the App Store. We can also do the animation at the same time. So as part of the design process, let me start from scratch. And I'm going to explain to you guys what are some of the decisions that I'm going to be making at the same time. So if you don't have a Figma account, of course, you should get Figma. It's a great tool. It allows you to do real-time collaboration. It has all the mature design tools that you might expect. Typically, when you start a new document, you're going to click on a plus. And at this point, you can change the color of the background, which I like to do because I'm really getting used to dark mode, to be honest. So I like to have a dark background, which is darker than my UI. So first of all, I'm going to create a screen, and typically I design on a screen that I use personally. Now, when it comes to UI, the first thing you want to think about is how do you want to present it? What is the content? First of all, I'm going to start with a square. So I'm going to set this to 335 and 335. So it's going to be a square. The way that I like to design is to have the proper padding. So we're going to have 20 on each side. I like to be consistent. Usually you're going to have 16 or 20. Usually you want your numbers to be divided by 4. So you're inside a grid. I do that naturally. A lot of people like to have a grid. So you can go to here and you can add the layout grid, for example, and you can set it to 4. And when you set it like this, the key is to make sure that your UI is always landing on the lines of those grid. It's going to make your design a little bit more control, if you will, but depending on if you're really into grid or not, personally, I prefer to use distances that are divided by 4. So I'm not going to use a grid for now. And we're going to start with the title. So I'm going to press a T and then I'm going to set the fonts. Typically, if you're designing for iOS, you're going to set SF Pro, display for the titles, and SF Pro text for the text. The difference between the two is the spacing between the letters. And titles typically, because the letters are bigger, then you can afford having the letters having less space and it's still readable. So the key here is to make sure that your text is always readable. Now in iOS, if you know your sizes, we're going to have a iOS handbook. So you're going to be able to follow that. SF Pro display for the title. So you can see between the two, the letters have more or less spacing. And for a title, typically you're going to use bold. So this is my title. And as a designer, I want to point out something. I've worked with a lot of junior designers. And what I noticed that because they don't really understand SwiftUI or iOS design and the built-in controls, they tend to start everything from scratch using a custom design. But you don't have to have a custom design. And in fact, you shouldn't have a custom design most of the time. Such as the title, for example, you don't want to have a custom design because you want to use a navigation view, you want to use the tab bar, you want to use the sidebar, and those things have certain amount of control, but most of the structure is not going to be customizable. So it's important to keep those things in mind, and why I would recommend anyone to go to the iOS design guidelines and the resources. So for example, iOS UI Kit, Apple has a bunch of resources about this, and you can go to the website and download SF symbols, which is really important for using the icons without having to customize anything. And then you have the sketch library where you have the entire UI kit, and it's a very good starting point, especially when you're not familiar with iOS. So back to my card. I have 20 padding on each side. It's a square, and I'm gonna set about 30 or 20 in terms of corner radius. And if you want to use exactly the smooth corners of iOS, you can use this thing called corner smoothing in Figma. Sketch has something equivalent to that. So it's a little bit more fun, and it follows the shape of the iPhone. So for example, if you have the iPhone 10, you can use the corner smoothing set to 60%, and you're gonna set the corner radius to about 30. So this looks a little bit like the iPhone. I would say even 40 looks like the corner radius of the iPhone. And the key here is to make sure that the corner of your card fits perfectly with the corner of the phone. So that is the goal and why we have a certain amount of corner radius, because it looks weird if I set it to 5 like this. Do you see how weird it looks? Instead, I'm gonna set it to about 30. So now it looks a lot better. It feels like there's a line that is consistent in the corner here. Okay? So that's my goal. And in terms of colors, iOS also has a bunch of colors that you can use. And again, the UI kit is going to give you exactly that, as well as the iOS guidelines. So let me just go quickly to iOS design guidelines. For those who have never used, should definitely go to the human interface and select your platform. In this case, it's going to be iOS. You want to go to visual design. And right now we're talking about colors, so I'm going to go to colors, and it's a really good read if you want to get into design. But these are the colors that you can use, and they are also available in SwiftUI, so you can just have a reference to it, like dot blue, and you're going to get exactly this color in light mode and then in dark mode. Notice that the color in light mode is slightly darker than the color in light mode, because you want to have the best contrast possible. Again, contrast, accessibility are important things in iOS. So I have my card, and of course I can set one of those colors. You don't want it to be too vibrant, which is here, and you don't want it to be too light, which lacks contrast. So you want it to be roughly here, so that you have good vibrancy and energy. When you look at it, you feel like excited to click on it. And that's like the power of colors, why the buttons are typically colorful and the texts are not, because they want you to click on it, and they want to guide your eyes to interact with that element. So that's exactly what we have. And on top of that, so this, if you're designing for Android, this is great. You have a flat color. But if you're designing for iOS, you want to use more like the gradient, so linear gradient, for example. And typically you can get from top to bottom, but I like to spice it up a little bit from top left to bottom. And let's say I have a blue, and you want to use an analogous color next to it. So make sure that it gives a nice complement to it. And you can use analogous, which is the color next to it, such as green and purple and violet or red or pink. So you can see these two works really well together, and you can play a little bit to give a nice little gradient for your UI. So let's say I pick something like this. If you want to avoid using an image, or if your UI doesn't need an image, that's fine. And otherwise, if you do like images, you can always go to a website called Unsplash. And Unsplash is a stock photo library of people submitting that, and it's completely free. You can use that inside your app. So unsplash.com, and I'm gonna search for colors. And again, all of these photos are completely free. So you're gonna see really cool background. The one that I really like is this one. Is a macro library, a macro photography. And I don't know if you guys are hearing the sound of my kids screaming in the background. Do you guys hear? Oh, that's amazing. So I'm using Crisp, which removes background noise like kids talking in the background. And it's really funny because I hear it so well, and my staff is telling me that they don't hear it. But anyways, I have my macro photography here, and I love good colors. So for example, this is a really nice composition of colors. It gives me a lot of energy when I look at it. Yeah, you want to pick something that is not too busy like this one, because when it's too busy, then it distracts from reading. But when it's more like a background noise, imagine like an ambient music versus a song that the person talks a lot. That's the difference. That's kind of like the same thing, but in UI design, you don't want a background that is too noisy. So you want something that if you put a bunch of text on it, you can still read it really well, and that doesn't steal too much the attention, or if it does it in a way that is more subtle, that is more not like a bunch of lines or something that might get in the way like this thing here. So I'm going to use this one, and you can download this for free. And I'm just going to drag and drop that image. It might be a little bit big, so I'm going to have to resize it like this. Okay. There's a bit of a thing that I noticed in the iOS App Store is that they don't show the entire image in the card. Only when you go full screen, it shows the entire image. I'm going to explain that later in code, but I don't exactly set the size. Rather, I set to be slightly bigger than the size. Okay? And now I want to mask this. So I want to make sure that this is on top of my card. So I'm going to use my rectangle, and I'm going to duplicate it, set this as a mask, and voila. And now you have your image that is masking around the edges of your card. And typically when you're masking something, you want to group it so that it's isolated. Otherwise, any element that is on top of that is going to be masked as well. So I have my card here, and I can put the card shape underneath. And now I'm going to set some text. So app of the day, for example. So I'm going to move it like this, and I also want to use a background blur because we love background blur in iOS. It gives the depth, and it also brings the context of colors, so you're not losing the color. So let me just show you the difference. So I have my black color here, and this is boring. It's not boring, it's just that it won't fit as much for iOS, and typically you want your app to fit the design language of the platform. And this is a good solution if most of your app is using flat colors. But if you're using shadows, you're using different gradients and stuff like that, you want to use gradients as well. So the other solution to this is to use opacity. So for example, I can use 80% opacity, always keeping in mind that you want the text to be readable. So I'm going to duplicate this text. I'm going to put this on top of my background. I'm going to set it to white. And of course, I have less space means smaller fonts. So I'm going to set this to, let's say, 17, and it doesn't have to be in caps. So for example, I'm going to set DesignCode. And then I want to have a subtitles. You don't want the two texts to have the same size because you want to have some hierarchy. So I'm going to set learn Swift, UI, React, and let's say UI design. Okay. Now I'm not going to wrap this, so I'm going to use auto size. And the second text is going to be 13. It's going to be regular, or you can use medium if you want to make it a little bit more readable. Secondly, you want to use hierarchy also in terms of the opacity or the color to be more secondary. So for example, these two are whites, so you want the second text, which is less important, to be, let's say, 70%. So now we have more hierarchy, which is beautiful. It's easier to read. Now, so you can see that I'm using SF display, and this is harder to read. But let me switch it to SF Pro Text, and now this is much easier to read, especially for smaller text. And the same for the title inside the box. I'm going to use SF Pro Text. The rule is if it's size 20 or plus, it's going to be display. 19 or less is going to be text. So that's the rule set by iOS. It's in the guidelines, by the way. And now, in terms of the size of your boxes and the clickable area, what I can recommend is about 44, which is the magical number in iOS. This is where, like, every button, most buttons in iOS, most rows in iOS, when you press on a list view or a table view and stuff like that, each row is about 44. But of course, depending on the amount of content, if it's just a title, that's fine. But since I have two texts, it's going to have to be a little bit bigger. So I can set it to 60. The magic numbers are about 44, and then 60, and then 88. So those are typically the numbers that I would use. If it's less than that, I would use 36. Or if it needs to be smaller, then I would use 32. But very rarely I'm going to use less than those numbers. Okay, so I have this, and then I'm going to set the logo for my app. Again, we have around the corners. I'm going to set it to 10. So now you can see that it's not using the masking of the card. So I'm going to use exactly that. I'm going to put this inside my folder, and automatically it's going to set the masking like this. I'm going to set consistent spacing. So I want to make sure that the top spacing is the same as the bottom and the same as the left. And I'm going to set this to 36. So now you can see I have 12, 12, 12, and then 12 to the text. The same for the text, as much as you can, depending on what kind of text that you have. But let's say I have 12, and then let's say I'm going to try to get 12, and voila. So that's like the rules that you're getting if you're not sure. I'm going to set this to white, and I'm going to bring my logo. So the logo that I have, you can put the logo of your app, of course, but I'm going to use this one, which is the logo of DesignCode. Whoops, so that didn't copy correctly. Let me copy the whole thing. Okay, let me resize it. Usually when you resize buttons and UI, you want to use the K because it's going to scale instead of resizing. When you resize, it's only going to resize the element itself. It doesn't resize the drop shadow. It doesn't resize the inner shadow, or like even the outline are gonna be not gonna be resized. So typically when you resize, you want to use the K, which is scale. And so I'm gonna set it to 36 by 36, and I'm gonna bring that right here by using cut Command X and then Shift Command V to paste in place. And then I'm going to set the corner radius, and voila, I have my logo. Now, you're going to be asking, why did we go through all of this trouble? It's kind of boring. Hopefully not, but it's going to get interesting. We're going to get into the code. Don't worry about it. First of all, so I have my card, and I want to group my things correctly. So this is my card. Okay. And I want to add some drop shadows because I love drop shadows. And I'm going to set this to a corner radius. Okay, so this is the corner radius, and then I'm going to set the effects using a drop shadow. The drop shadow typically is going to set to 20 and the Y position to 10. So usually I use the Y position to be half of the size of the radius, which is a blur. And yeah, this looks pretty good. The other thing that I like to use is also contextual drop shadow. So I can use the same color of, I don't know, the most obvious color of the card. But this only works well if you have a gradient or a single card. But otherwise, if you don't want that, you can always use just the black color. And that works pretty well. So this is a live stream, and sometimes I lose my thoughts. As you can see here, I forgot that I was supposed to show you guys the background blur. And so you can see now I have the opacity. I can also use another technique, which is to set a linear gradient, and I can have a nice gradual opacity like this. This is nice, right? It works well. I can also do something like this. So it works well. I just wanted to show you that there are different ways to design for the same goal. And this one is not bold enough, so I'm going to make this even bolder by using heavy. And then I want to show you background blur. Typically, when you use background blur, you don't want to use too much opacity on your color, so I can even use 10%. Now, why do we use background blur? Why do we use this background here? It's for legibility. So if you have text that is small like this, without the background, it's hard to read. Now, to solve this issue, you want to have a background, such as 50%. Then I showed you the other technique with a gradial background, but now I'm going to show you how to set the effect for background blur. And background blur in iOS has exactly that goal. It's like that frosted glass that you have, and it creates a really nice context. You still get the beautiful lights and colors from outside. Let's say you have a beautiful door with frosted glass. You still see the beautiful colors outside. And that's the goal that we have here, is still to see the context in which you have, but still make your content readable. So there you go. I'm setting the background blur to about 40. That's typically what we get in iOS. Now, we went through all this trouble, and why? That's because I love to plan my animations. I don't like to design in a code because I have a lot of limitations when I do that. And I want to show you how I'm going to plan my animation. A lot of designers, they don't spend as much time in terms of the interaction and how it's going to work. They focus too much on the aesthetics and the staticness of the design, but that's not how I design at all. I usually design by planning how I'm going to animate it and how it's going to work, how the data is going to be. And so I have my screen one, which is the home, let's say, and then I want this to animate to a second screen. Now, the key to animation, because we're going to be using mesh geometry effect to create this animation. Now, in order to do that, you need to be using shared elements. How is it going to be animated? So this is going to animate to this screen. The first thing is we're going to resize. So already you can see my animation working. But of course, I have some constraints issues, so I might want to set my constraints. I don't want to bore you too much with the constraints because sometimes it can be a little bit complex to explain. But let me group this together, okay? And let me set this to bottom left, or I can even set middle, so center, bottom. And when I do this, it doesn't scale anymore, hopefully. Well, it still does, so that's not good. And which is why I try to avoid it. But I can do center here, and I'm gonna make sure that, yeah, this does not scale. As you can see, it's scaling. So I'm gonna set center so it doesn't scale. So hopefully this is gonna be fine. It is fine for the logo, but it's not fine for the actual container. So center and then center. I don't want to bore you guys with the constraints. Okay, I see that this is separate. So I might as well just do this. Okay, it's still scaling. Okay, maybe I can fix this by setting it to bottom because it was scaling. Otherwise, I'm just going to copy and paste back. Constraints can be a little bit hard, especially to do in a live stream. So I'm going to just copy and paste. So let me just resize this. So my animation is going to work exactly like this. And maybe it's going to resize. Obviously, this is going to be in the background. So I'm going to put this in the background. And I might move my text to be at the top of the screen. So you can see things are moving. And then finally, I have this bar here that I copy and paste. And I'm going to resize this bar. But it also resizes the content, which is a little bit annoying. Let me just... The thing about constraints is that, to be honest, the design tool changes it all the time. So it's hard to catch up with the way constraints work for every single version of the design tool. And so I'm just going to select the background and resize it. So it's not going to affect my element. When you resize the entire container, it also affects the child elements. And by the way, this concept also applies to SwiftUI, and I'm going to explain why. Typically, you don't want to apply mass geometry on the container itself, and that's exactly why explained in the design tool itself. It can affect your elements inside the container. So there you go. And maybe I want to remove the corner radius as well. And yes, so Figma has a bit this annoying feature where you need to have a dedicated mask layer. So if you change the corner radius, you have to change the corner radius on both elements. And voila, this is how my animation is going to work. So I have my card here that is going to transition to this full screen view. It's going to move this element here, and it's going to move the title as well. And maybe I can also have some text underneath here outside of the card and apply that. So I'm going to set this to regular. There you go. So I'm switching from multiple cards to the full screen mode. Are you guys ready to do that in SwiftUI? Awesome. Designing in SwiftUI is the same, is almost the same as designing in the design tool. First of all, I create a new file, a new project, and I'm starting with the basic template of iOS. I'm going to resume this. And let me just remove the padding first. And I'm going to change the text to today while we wait. The first time you load your project is definitely going to take more time, and especially because I'm recording right now, it's taking a lot of CPU, so it might take a little bit more time. And while I do that, I'm just going to copy some beautiful text from Apple so I can make my design a little bit prettier. And let me set the size. Okay. So while my Xcode is loading, yes, it's working now. I'm also going to set the line height to be roughly 150%. So if it's 17 multiplied by 1.5, it's about 24 roughly, maybe a little bit more. And yeah, consistent spacing, so 20 from each side, 335, and there you go. Two different apps. We have this scroll, and then it goes to the full view. Perfect. Now, just for the sake of creating a custom layout, I'm not going to use the navigation view for this demo. So I'm just going to create a large title first. I'm going to set .font .large title. As I explained to designers, this is why we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to come up with our own font size and stuff like that. We can use one of the presets from Apple. So in this case, I'm going to set to bold, and I'm going to put this inside a VStack, and then I'm going to put my card. Okay, so let me create my card. My card is also going to be a VStack. Let me set the title first, so the text. App of the day. You can change this to uppercase by, after the quote, you set .uppercase. Because this is a string, you can manipulate the string, and that's the beauty of Swift. And then I'm going to put this inside a VStack, and I'm going to set the size of my card. Typically, you want to avoid using fixed size as much as possible. Okay, so I don't necessarily want to set the width to 335, but the height is pretty fixed in your design. So I'm going to set the height to 335. So that's great. And instead of using a fixed width, I'm going to use a max width. And this is going to allow me to use the maximum space. But max width and height doesn't work together. You're going to have to use max height to match with max width. So like this, I'm taking the maximum space. And then I'm going to set a background. So I'm going to set a color for now, and then we can put an image later. Let me show you how to create around the corners. Would you like to learn that? Yeah? Awesome. Let's do that. Now I can set the easy one, which is corner radius. But the thing is, designers, we don't mind suffering a little bit to get the proper corner radius. We're going to use another modifier that is a little bit more fun. First of all, let me add some padding, because without padding, it's just really ugly. So the padding by default, by the way, is 16. But if I wanted to set it just like the design, is going to be 20. And here, this is not scripted, by the way. I'm improvising everything. Corner radius, and I'm going to set, yes, I wanted to show you, instead of the corner radius, we can use clip shape. And basically, this is going to allow me to have that beautiful smooth corners for iOS. So now you can see that I can clip the entire thing using a circle, but I can also use rounded rectangle, parentheses, corner radius, and style. So my corner radius is going to be 30, and it's going to be continuous, and that is my Apple corner radius. So there you go. I have my Apple corner radius, and by default, every single element is going to be centered. So I have my layout, which is at the bottom left. I'm going to create another container for this background blur. So let me create that container for the background blur. But first of all, let's set the background. So I'm going to bring this image right here, and I'm going to go to the assets catalog. So I'm going to drag and drop the image. Okay. The name does matter, but we're going to cheat a little bit. We're not cheating. We're actually using something called an image literal to make it faster to switch between the names. But typically you want to name this, right? You want to name like image 1, or you want to call it using an API from a URL and load that dynamically. But if you're going to include that inside your app, first of all, it's going to take app space, right? It's okay for icons, glyphs, app icons, but typically when it comes to content, you want to store this in a database somewhere. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to store it in my assets catalog. So now I'm going to resume, and I'm going to bring my image instead of the color. Okay. So now I'm going to replace the color by using an image, parentheses, UI image, and I'm going to set image literal. We have the image, and using image literal, I'm able to select from my images library. And just like that, I'm able to use that image right away. By default, it's going to take the original size of the image, so I'm going to set something called resizable. Now, the problem with resizable is that it does not respect the aspect ratio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set aspect ratio to dot fit. Or I can also use it to dot fill, because if I'm using it like this, it's not going to fit the actual container, which you can see by the blue line here, we have some empty space. So I'm going to use fill instead. And voila, we have our beautiful background image. And then I'm going to set the drop shadow. So I'm going to use the shadow, let's say 20 or 10. So this is the default shadow, but I do like to have a more custom shadow, because I like to move my shadow downwards a little bit. So I'm going to use a custom shadow using a color. So I like to use color.black.opacity 0.3. I'm just going to set my radius to 20, x to 0, and y to 10. So now we have a much more beautiful drop shadow. Let's take a look at the title. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So I'm going to use the same size as the large title, and I'm going to make this bold. Okay. Then I'm going to create my container. So vstack, and I'm going to set the 3 elements. So I have my logo here and the 2 text. In this case, this is my vstack, and this would be my hstack. So let me start with the 2 text element first. DesignCode, and then the second text. Okay, so I have my two text, and then I'm gonna put this inside an H tag. I'm gonna use an image. So let me create a rounded rectangle, or I can just use an image. So I'm gonna have to export this image first. When you export something, you don't want to have the rounded corners. I'm gonna have to remove the rounded corners first, and gonna rename this to logo. Then I'm gonna export this. So you can definitely use PNG, but if your elements are in vector, then I would definitely suggest using PDF instead. Otherwise, you're gonna have to export three formats, three files, one at 1x, 2x, and 3x. So I'm just gonna export at 1x using PDF. So I'm gonna change this to logo 1, and I'm gonna bring that to my assets catalog. And then we're gonna set the logo. So image, UI image, and then image lit. So this is going to allow me to select from one of those images. Let me resume this. And we should see the logo right here. There you go. So we're gonna set the frame width 36, height 36, and then we're gonna set the corner radius to 10. Now I have my V stack here, which is my card, and my H stack should definitely be inside that V stack, so I placed it wrong. So now I should see it right here. What I'm gonna use to push, I'm gonna use a spacer to push this down, like this. My H stack, as you can see, is not taking the full width, so I'm gonna use the frame max width dot infinity, and then I'm going to use some padding. So the padding is 12, and we're gonna set the background to black for now, and then we're going to set opacity to 0.8. I'm gonna apply the background blur later, but for now you can see that I have black text on top of a black background, and currently it's not properly aligned. What we can do here, first of all, my V stack, I want to align the text, but first of all, I want to show you guys that there's a beautiful thing in SwiftUI where you can apply a modifier and it's going to apply all its children. That's a really nice trick that I picked up. So for example, if I want to have both texts to be white without having to set the color for each of those texts, I can set dot foreground color on the V stack, set it to white, it's going to apply to both. Isn't that beautiful? And then I'm going to set the alignment to leading. And I want my title to be a little bit bigger and my text to be a little bit smaller. I'm going to use dynamic fonts. So font dot, let's use headline, which is smaller. Even smaller, caption. And the font is going to be body.bold. This is looking pretty good. I'm gonna add a little bit of spacing. So we have the V stack. You can see by the blue lines here, it's like a design tool. And in this other V stack, the title is way too near the actual card. So there are two ways to go about this. One is you can use a spacer to push the two, and it's going to go to the top and this one goes to the bottom. The other thing you can do is to set a spacing, sorry, and let's set to 16 between each element. So you're going to see more spacing here. And on top of that, if you put all of this inside a scroll view, it's going to push everything to the top of the UI. But instead of doing that, I'm just going to push everything at the bottom of the VStack. I want to keep things simple for the match geometry effect. So now it's going to the top. And for the title, instead of using the H stack, which I tend to not like very much because it adds a lot of containers, I like to use the max width dot infinity and set alignment. Sorry, it's lagging to leading. Now it seems that I have some issues. Max width, yes, I'm missing a D here. So it's going to push this to the left, and voila, that's great. Now what we want to do is to set our text to the bottom left. So as you guessed it, I love clean code, and so I'm going to use the frame technique instead of doing H stack, V stack. So I'm going to use max width dot infinity, max height dot infinity, and I'm going to align this, boom, to the bottom left. So that's another great thing about using alignment, is that you can align it within your container in even a diagonal direction. This is why I love doing this. And here we're missing some padding, so I'm going to add exactly that. So there you go. Please keep in mind that when you're using a VStack like this one, it's going to have a default spacing between the two elements. This is why when I select this text frame here, it's showing a bit of spacing between this and the bottom bar. So what I need to do to fix that, I'm going to set a spacing to 0. So let's see. Oh, I have a spacer, and this, maybe also the spacer is causing that. Yes, there you go. So the spacer was causing that, and now you can see that because I'm using a max height, I do not need the spacer anymore, and the max height is taking care of this. The other thing I can do is that if I want to set this into 2 lines of text, I can either use non-breaking space. Some of you might be aware of this one. Or I can also use a frame width. So I can set a max width of, I don't know, 120 maybe. So let's see if it works. And in this case, I'm going to have to push it to the left. And I believe I can use alignment to leading. No, the VStack only allows you to align to the top, so I can't do that. What I can do is also do another frame, which, yeah, it gets a little bit heavy to have multiple frames, but it works. And in this case, it does work. So max width, there's just so many ways to do the same thing. At the end of the day, you have to select what is the best way for you. And here I have this. I'm not sure why I have an issue. Oh, sorry, alignment infinity, of course. This is why the slowness is not helping when it comes to auto-completion. Okay, so this should be pushing to the left, as you can see, and then I have a maximum width frame for my text, which allows me to have a certain number of lines instead of having everything in one line. So in design, it makes the text a little bit more readable, like this. I might want to put 150 instead, so I can fit more words into a single line. And there you go. If we look back at the design, you can see that this is what I want. I don't want this to be in a single line. I want this into 2 lines. And so I created 2 frames. One that was taking care of the height and aligning it to the bottom left. And the other one was to, because I'm using a max width of 150, is to align everything to the left. So this is awesome. It saves me a lot of trouble. One thing you need to know is that every time you're using a frame, it's like using a V stack or an H stack. Every time you're using a modifier, especially when it comes to styling modifiers, it's like using a container, which is why I'm using 2 frames to do the job of exactly this. So now that I have our layout, and maybe I can push this content here to the left, so I can use a spacer. Okay, let's hope it works. Yes, it does work. And voila, we have our layout. Now this is where we get to the fun part, because we want to do the animation. So the first thing is, I'm going to create a new view that is going to take exactly the same elements as this view. Okay? So let me go to my navigation, and here I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be called detail view, let's say. Okay, I have my detail view, and I'm going to copy exactly this layout to the new view. Okay. Then I'm going to resume this, and I'm going to try to apply exactly the layout for this view here. So that is important, to reuse the same views that we were using previously, and to reuse the shared elements. Okay, so for example, I don't need a today. So this is the beauty of mass geometry effect, is that you don't need to have exactly the same things, exactly the same elements, exactly the same structure. You can mix and match as long as the elements are shared. But it doesn't matter how well they're structured or synchronized they are in terms of like exactly the same structure. You can see I simply remove the title. I don't need it anymore. And then I don't need the padding anymore. So it's gonna just move to the whole width of the screen. I don't need the corner radius. So let's see, I have my corner radius right here, so I don't need that. I can set it to 0. And yeah, I can set, actually, I don't even need the parent container if I don't want to use it. But I'm gonna keep it just because I want to align everything to the top. But otherwise, another thing that I want to do is ignore safe area, so I can take even the notch space. Isn't that beautiful? So now I also want to set to a bigger height. So right now it's max height 335, so I can set it maybe to 500. And there you go. That's exactly what I have here, right? In my design. The only missing thing is that I should be using the background blur. And this is getting a bit long, so I don't know if I should be using the background blur, but let's do it. Why not? First of all, you're going to need the Fruta app. There's also another really cool library called SwiftUI X that gives you the missing stuff that SwiftUI is missing from UIKit. And one of those things is the background blur. hopefully it's gonna work because I haven't tried it yet. I'm used to using the source code from the Fruit app from Apple. But if this does not give me trouble, let's install a SwiftUI package. Let's cross fingers that it's going to work. So now I'm installing a package and it's going to start to install it. Finish. Okay. Going back to my view here, I'm going to look at their documentation for the blur effect. So visual effect view. Okay, there you go. So this is how you should be using it. So visual effect blur view. And I believe that I need to import it first, but let me try without importing it. So I have my background color here, which is using a colored.black. I'm going to replace this with a visual effect. No, it's not here. So I'm going to have to import it. Import SwiftUI X. And if I do that, I believe I'm going to be able to use that visual effect view. There you go. Visual effect blur view, parentheses. And here I can set the blur style. And I'm going to set to system material because it adapts to light mode and dark mode automatically. If you want it to adapt, maybe this one I actually don't want it to adapt. I always want it to be in dark mode or in light mode. So let me check my design to make sure. I believe that I was using, yes, the black because I have a white text, so I want to use contrast. Now, this is trying to build because I install a library. It takes a little bit of time to apply it and start using it. But while it's waiting and while it's building, see, there's a little bit of loader here. And by the way, when it comes to the preview, the background blur is not going to look well. And also I'm going to use a dark one because I have white text. There you go. So I have my background blur, but in the preview it does not look good. So I'm going to show you how it works when we're going to be in iOS Simulator later. But right now, this is what I have, and I'm going to do the same thing for the background here. That is for the card. Okay. That's it. We have our layout. Oh yes, I have an import SwiftUI X. There you go. And now it should stop complaining. Now, we are going to set the animations. So the first thing we want to do to set up our animation is to set an if statement and switch between two screens. That's simple enough. We're going to set the state var show is equal to false by default. Secondly, I'm going to put my two layouts inside a Z stack. So embed in Z stack first, because the Z stack allows me to stack in a three-dimensional way two different layouts. And then I'm going to do if show is equal to false. And I'm going to put my first layout, which is this one, inside parentheses. Okay? And I'm going to do an else statement in the else statement. So when I'm going to be switching between the two views, I'm going to show the other view, which is the detail view. So I have my first view, my first screen here, and I have my second screen here. Cool. Now, I'm going to do some basic transition first, because before getting into the more complex match geometry, we should at least get the basics done. Right now, I have my Z stack, and I want to set an interaction in which when I do untap gesture, it's going to toggle between true and false if I want to show the new screen or not. And let's take a look. So I have my default screen, click on it, the other screen, right? That's magical. Click back, first screen, click back again, the other screen. It's beautiful. So now I want some animation. Let me set animation.spring. There you go. So right now it's using a transition. It's not using a beautiful App Store quality transition. And that's what we're going to learn today. We're going to learn the beautiful App Store quality transition. So first of all, I'm going to need namespace. Var namespace. I'm going to need my namespace in order to apply my animations inside that space. And secondly, I'm going to need to set the elements that I want to transition. Let's start with the title, shall we? We're going to start with the text that says App of the Day, because between the two screens, we have these two titles. So I'm going to set dot match geometry effect, and this is going to be called a title. Every single element that are shared has to have an ID and has to have a namespace, which I just declared. Okay? And on top of that, the other view has to also have that namespace. Okay? So I'm going to set it on the same shared element, which is App of the Day title. They are exactly the same. Now, it's going to complain. It's going to say, what is the namespace? Of course, I could say namespace, var namespace. But the problem with this is that the two are not synchronized together. They're not the same namespace anymore. What I need to do is to pass the namespace from one parent to the child component. Okay? And so instead of declaring a new namespace, I'm going to set a var of type namespace dot ID. So I'm going to receive this variable from the parent. And on top of that, I'm going to need, for the preview to work, okay, I'm going to need a static namespace. So namespace static. This is just for the preview. It doesn't matter what is the namespace because we don't really need the animation at this point in this screen. So we're only doing some generic namespace to be able to satisfy the preview. Namespace, static namespace. I'm going to need var namespace. And I'm going to input this because now that I have my variable for this detail view, it needs to have a namespace. And I'm going to use that namespace for the preview to work. Next, I'm going to need to input that from the content view. So I'm going to need to pass this namespace that I have declared and pass it to my child component. So detail view, namespace. Now the two namespaces are synchronized. And this is important because if I don't do this, the animations will not synchronize together using the same namespace. If I do Command B, I should have a build successful. And at this point, my animation should start to work because match geometry using the same namespace between the two views, and both are using the same ID, which is title. So let's test the animation, shall we? Click on resume. Let's see what it looks like. Are we excited? All right, let's click on it. Boom. Did you see that? Do you see that beautiful text that transition from one screen to another? That's awesome, right? Now, let's do the same for the rest because we are just getting started. So I'm going to copy this namespace and I'm going to apply that, let's say to the, no, I don't want to apply that to the entire H tag because on a container, it does not work that well. but on the background, it does work really well. Sometimes you have to experiment between if you want to do it right after the element or after the modifiers of the element. So there are definitely some tricky things going on. Typically, I do recommend to do it directly after this, but sometimes it does not work. So for example, for the background image, it needs to be done before, like after the aspect ratio. This is something that requires a little bit of experimentation. So I'm going to name this image, and I'm going to go to the other view and apply that also to the image. So where is my image? Is right here. Typically though, I would say do it before the frame. But in some instances, such as the image here, you might need to do it differently. So let's give it a try. There you go. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? So now I also need to set it based on the clip shape. We know that we cannot apply it to a modifier, right? Like we cannot apply it to the container itself. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. And honestly, I haven't tried this like this using a clip shape. So I'm just praying right now that it's going to work. So let me say shape. All right, so I'm gonna try with this. I'm just gonna pray that it's gonna work because I've never done this before. All right, let's see. So this is shape, and it's applying to the round rectangle, which is responsible for clipping the content. So clip shape conform to view. So maybe this is not gonna work in the end. If it's not, then I'm gonna have to skip that modifier. Okay, let's try with a mask instead of a clip shape. Okay, so the mask does seem to work. Hopefully this is my luck as a designer. And let's see if it actually works. Wow, it actually does work to some extent. Look at that. We do have some issues. So this is not bulletproof. As you can see, the rounded corners are not working perfectly. And when things are not working, it's trying to use the default transition, which is the opacity. So the next thing I want to do is the background blur, the two texts here, and then the image. So normally I definitely want to do this as a container, but yes, this is not from my experience, to apply it on a container is not the best thing you can do. But at least we're getting somewhere. At least we're getting perfectly for the title. We're getting perfectly for the image. We're having some trouble with the corner radius that is doing a clip shape. So we switched to a mask instead of a clip shape to remedy that. But I can apply it to these three elements. I know it's going to work for sure. So I can try that. So match geometry, and this one is going to be app name maybe. And then the other one is going to be app description or description. So I'm just going to copy and paste to make sure that I don't make a typo when I'm going to go to the next screen. Okay, so we have app name, and then we have the description. All right, let's see. So I'm gonna wait for this to run. There you go. So the title is also working. We're missing the image here. It's definitely a labor of love. This is what I can tell you. If you're a UI person, this is the kind of labor of love that you have to apply to your work. Okay, there's no shortcut if you want to build something that is both functional and beautiful. And I'm gonna do the same for the logo. All right, so I'm not sure if I should put it after the corner radius, but let's give it a try. So this is logo. And this one as well. If it doesn't work, I can always put it before the frame. I know a lot of people on our team who are doing UI and they're like not really getting into animations yet, but what I can tell you is that if you want to do UI, if you want to be a good UI developer, this is the kind of thing you need to get good at. Boom, look at that. We're getting somewhere. And then we're just missing the bottom bar. So the bottom bar, this is the visual effect view. So blur, I'm gonna name it blur. And let's resume this. I'm actually surprised that the background blur works in a preview. It did not work before. So maybe Xcode changed something. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? Look at that. I'm delighting myself right now. And that's because I haven't done it before and I'm just doing it for the first time. I'm like, wow, this is actually working really well. The only thing that I would say is missing, I want to show you that this is actually really flexible. So for example, I can change the size of my max width to 700. And this resume is really killing me right now. But you can see, wow, this is so cool. I'm sorry, we're gonna have to cut this part where I'm just amazed at my work. So apart from the clip shape, which I'll try to find a solution, this is it. I can always add some content on the other view. So for example, in this view here, I'm gonna set it before the spacer. I'm gonna set a text. And I'm gonna use this text right here. So let's see how it looks like. Make sure that you don't have any spacing, otherwise you're gonna have an issue. And there you go. So I'm gonna need some padding. Okay. So let's see what it's gonna look like when I add some new content. And of course, I can even add like a scroll view. There you go. This is where the transition comes in. Right now, it's doing a transition that is opacity, which is a default transition between screens. But I can also set to, let's say, when I go to the detail view, I can set dot transition. And I can set slide or move from the edge bottom. Let's see how it's gonna look like. Whoa, okay. So this is getting weird. But you can see that there's some stuff that is going on that I don't fully understand. I actually want the text to move from the bottom, but not for the rest, which is doing some crazy thing here. Maybe I'm gonna try something. Maybe I can add the transition only on the text. Let's see if that works. If it doesn't work, tough luck for me. So we are experimenting together. I hope this is exciting for you as much as it is for me. No, it's not working. Okay. So I'm gonna try to find a solution for trying to to slide the text. I know another way to do it, which is to do unappear. And since I mentioned it, I feel bad to not show it this technique. So let me just apply that technique right now. State var appear is equal to false by default. Okay. And then when this view is going to be appearing, so I'm going to set dot unappear curly braces, and I'm going to set appear is equal to true. And when this view disappears, so on disappear, appear is equal to false. Using this state change, I can always do some crazy animation. So for example, I can use offset Y, and if it appears, then it's going to be 0, otherwise 100, so 100 to the bottom at first. So let's hope that this works. Unless the appear is not working. Let me see. Appear. I'm going to try to put it here, and perhaps that will work. So when you appear, it goes to 0, otherwise by default is 100. And right now, I cannot preview this, but I can always try here. And I'm going to resume this. It does work. See, it comes from the bottom, and then it disappears after. So you can do a lot of crazy things here at this point. So for example, I can make it move from the bottom, so I can set -300 at first. And now the text should be moving from the top to the bottom, like this. So this is a little bit more smooth, because when I expand this, the text is being pushed at the same time as the card is being expanded. That's awesome. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm going to be sharing the source code. And yeah, this is really fun. I hope you're going to try SwiftUI, build your own layout, design your own layout, and try all kinds of really cool animations. Thank you.